Hello, welcome to Calumet Perspectives, student-produced television program with interview with scholars and researchers that is broadcast to Northwest Indiana. My name is Lee Artz. I teach media studies here at Purdue Calumet, and I am one of the regular hosts for Calumet Perspectives. Today we're happy to have Professor Jerry Harris. He earned his degree in history and political economy at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and he's the secretary of the Global Studies Association of North America, which publishes the journal Globalizations. Professor Harris is a leading scholar of transnational capitalism and globalization. He's the author and contributor to many articles in journals of sociology and political economy, many that I've used in my own work, and I appreciate that. He's the author also of this book, Dialectics of Globalization, Economic and Political Conflict in a Transnational World. I was talking with Professor Harris just before, and I found out that we have something else in common. We're both former steelworkers in the Chicago area. You might be what Antonio Gramsci calls an organic intellectual. You learned your trade from a working class perspective. I actually would like to begin with that by calling you a member of the working class. It seems that in the university and probably in popular culture in general in the United States, the idea of a social class seems, I don't know, remote or quaint or at least marginalized. Why is that? Why don't we talk about social class in the United States?
Well, I think it's an uncomfortable discussion, particularly for those who run the country. So once you start to talk about class, you not only talk about a middle class or a working class, you have to talk about a capitalist class. And once you talk about a capitalist class, then you have to talk about capitalism. And then, of course, the discussion gets more serious because you go to structural and systematic problems rather than individual problems or policy problems. So I think the avoidance of the question of class is an important one in this country to avoid serious reforms and serious changes.
Your book and your work on globalization and transnationalism obviously has to start with questions of class, though, because it's about how production is organized and how we get the goods and services that we come to rely upon. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about transnationalism. What defines it, and how is this period different than, say, 40 years ago?
Well, Lee, both of us are probably old enough to remember the great old slogan of what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. Of course, they don't use that slogan anymore because it's no longer true. I think one way to think about it is in the 40s or 50s, even into the 60s, is that most U.S. corporations had the majority of their assets, the majority of their sales, the majority of their employment, certainly, inside the United States. And you could probably say the same is true for German corporations or French corporations or corporations around the world. Today, that's significantly changed because today, all the largest transnational corporations really have the majority of their assets, employment, sales outside their home country. And so we have the emergence of global assembly lines and certainly the flow of trillions of dollars across borders, merging a global economy. So that's going to change the nature of the capitalist class itself. It's no longer nationally based, rooted to a national market. It's really rooted to circuits of global accumulation.
So when you say it's no longer nationally based, does that mean that the General Motors, I mean, they always produce cars like in Mexico or Brazil, but they were owned by General Motors. So the way I understand it is now when General Motors produces cars in China, it's partially owned by a Chinese corporation. So it's not just U.S. corporation doing business in China, but it's a partnership between two sets of capitalist enterprises. Is that?
Yeah, it's part of it, very deeply so. I mean, the merger and cross-border mergers and financial investments are very deep, and I'd like to go into that a little more at some point. I think one of the differences in world trade today is true, particularly with GM. I mean, they were early producers in Germany, but really it was a international competition was through exports mainly, not through production across borders. So you produced in the United States and you sold your cars in Europe.
And that would keep workers in the U.S. employed selling cars abroad.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
And then you have your assembly lines all over the world.
Yep.
Or Japan is a good example, because you might remember the United Auto Workers had a large campaign against don't buy Japanese cars. But the Japanese came to America, right?
Yeah.
So now, particularly into the South.
Yes.
So you can buy
And Indiana.
And Indiana.
Yes.
And I think that's really true worldwide, is that corporations have penetrated markets everywhere in the world.
We have a graphic, I think you saw it before, which the United Nations came up with a formula to talk about a transnational index, which talks about total sales, total value, and the total number of employees. And the graphic shows those corporations that are the largest 50 corporations in the world, those that are more than 50% transnational. My question would be, how does this what difference does this make to, you know, the average worker in Northwest Indiana, that the company is transnational? Like, okay, I worked for Ford Torrance, or I worked for Toyota making Tundra. Why should I care, I guess, is the question.
Well, of course, jobs is one big issue, although jobs also come here from foreign corporations. But I think once your capitalist class loses its roots, that it has huge implications for the question of democracy and also for the questions of the social contract. In other words, decent jobs at decent wages and what we call the American dream, owning your house, doing well by your family, sending your kids to college. Why do we see this growth of inequality in wealth, greater levels of unemployment, part-time employment, temporary employment? All this, I think, is connected to the globalization of production and the globalization of finance. So I think it's very important in that sense.
We have another graphic that's of Lenovo, the Lenovo company. And this may be what you're talking about. Lenovo purchased IBM's PC unit. Lenovo just recently purchased Motorola's mobile phone unit. Lenovo is in negotiations now to buy Sony Vaio. They have a PC and electronics firm that they are part owner of in Germany, and another one in Brazil. In that sense, I guess the question is, what do you call it? Chinese, Brazilian, American, Japanese, and they produce everywhere. Part of this is what we read in the press is that the U.S. Companies and U.S. workers should be concerned about the rising power of Chinese industry. How does that, I mean, in the concept of transnationalism, how does that play out as something to pay attention to or to be concerned with?
Well, Walmart is a good example, because 80% of Walmart's products come from China. And I think one of the rather destructive political games that are being played upon American workers, and in fact workers around the globe, is to say that workers in other countries are your enemies, are your problem. So workers in China are stealing your jobs. Mexican immigrants are stealing your job. Well, Chinese workers, Mexican workers, Nigerian workers, we all want the same thing, right? We want decent wages, we want secure jobs, we want to do well by our families, we want to send our children to college. So workers are not each other's enemies. Who is running the global economic system aren't sweatshop workers in China or unemployed workers here in America. It's the transnational corporations and the transnational capitalist class. And so we need to direct our anger at the proper target and not be caught up in these sort of nationalist rhetoric and nationalist paranoia that is often propagated in the press.
I teach media studies and communication here, and one of the things that I note is that one of the reasons that people don't recognize it is the information that they receive. And this is largely presented as the market won't bear it, or the concept of neoliberalism, that we're in a global economy and we have to better compete. Do you want to talk a little bit about neoliberalism as a concept that carries the structure of transnationalism?
Yes. Well, any economic relations will produce an ideology and a philosophy to support it and to justify it. And I think neoliberalism is the ideology, in part, in consumerism that comes from transnational capitalism. So they want to make globalization and technology sort of forces outside of human control, that there's nothing that we can do about this stuff, and that you just have to bow down and accept that it's a race to the bottom to keep your job, and we'll employ you if you accept $5 an hour instead of $15 an hour.
That's why I'm here.
But of course we know that all this is structured by the transnational capitalist class itself. But they want to direct attention away from their power and their decision making towards these so-called trans-historical forces that seem greater than human beings.
You talked a little bit, you just mentioned there technology and telecommunications being what created globalization, as if they were almost superhuman, like some supernatural activity. Could you talk about that a little bit more? What else could technology or telecommunications do rather than what it's been used to do?
Yeah. Well, I don't think globalization would have been possible without the revolution in information technology. But the question is, how is the technology being used, right? So how has capitalism used these revolutionary tools? Because the tools can be used in many different ways. For example, in manufacturing, obviously we could produce a heck of a lot more with a lot less workers than we have ever before. So does that mean that we could all work a 32-hour work week? Or does that mean that we're going to be part-time and temporary workers? There's a choice to be made there. And of course, the capitalist, transnational capitalist class is going to choose the one that increases their profits and increases their power. So that's one way to look at it. I think in finance, it's particularly important to look at information technologies too, if we can go into that a bit.
Yeah, finance is kind of over my head and maybe over many people's head when you start talking about finance capital. So what I think we'll do now is take a little break. We'll be back after the break and I'll ask you that question. I have some other questions for you. So this is Calumet Perspectives. I'm your host, Lee Artz, and we'll be back in just a few seconds. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Calumet Perspectives. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I teach media studies at Purdue Calumet. My guest today is Jerry Harris, who's the Secretary of the Global Studies Association of North America, the author of many articles, and the book, The Dialectics of Globalization, that looks at transnationalism and the political and economic conflict. Just before we went to break, I was talking to you a little bit about the technology, telecommunications, and the relationship, you were mentioning the relationship between that and the financing of globalization. Would you talk about that a little bit more in terms that I can understand?
Well, I hope so. I think finance is at really the center of the transnational capitalist class. But it's really the information technologies that make this possible, because we have trillions and trillions of dollars crossing borders every day. So let me give you one example. the money markets or the foreign exchange markets. As we know that the value of money goes up and down, anyone who's traveled and exchanged money knows this, right? So the foreign exchange market is simply money buying money every day at $5.3 trillion every day. Now, it's hard to get your head around what a trillion means, but let me give you this example. 1 million seconds is 12 and a half days. So tell me what you think a trillion seconds would be.
Well, it'd be 1.5 million, like 12 million days, something like that.
Break it down to years for us.
Oh, she's sick. So now I got to divide. I don't know. Give it to her.
20 years, 50 years,
Oh,
100
okay.
years. What do you think?
Well, 12 million days. I don't. It sounds like thousands.
Thousands. That's very good because you're very close. So it's 36,000 years.
Wow.
So this is 5.3 trillion every day. So that's 1 trillion to 1 million. Now, without information technology, moving this type of money around is absolutely impossible. And the
It's a lot of
information,
Wells Fargo stagecoaches.
yeah, and most of this money is traded via algorithms. So you have a very small group of people writing software that is programmed to look for certain words and certain mathematical formulas. And they're on servers in huge warehouses. So for example, Goldman Sachs, already 6 years ago, had 50,000 servers just running algorithms. And these servers are reading other computers in China and in Frankfurt and in Tokyo. It's really the matrix. It's really this world of computers reading computers. And when they see the figures that they're looking for, or the words that they're looking for, they're going to do trades. And the average trade only takes place in 22 seconds, so it's not like it's long-term investments here. So what you're looking for is the arbitrage, the difference in the price of money that exists in the same moment of time, but in different places. So if you have euros in Frankfurt and euros in Tokyo, maybe there's a 1/10 of a 1 cent difference in the price. And if your computer picks up on that,
Could make some money.
it's going to make money. It's going to buy maybe 500 million, where it's 1/10 of a cent lower, and within a second, we'll start to unload that in the computers in Frankfurt, where it's 1/10 of a second more.
I can probably get my head around that, but I was of the belief that money represented something. Money represented work that people have done to make a cup or a table.
Well, that's the problem. Here we have money as a commodity itself. That's one of the great changes. So money has become something to buy and sell and make money from. In this process, and by the way, 66% of these trades are done simply by algorithms, right? And the speeds are so fast that in 1 second, the information could go around the world 7.5 times in 1 second. So this is obviously beyond human capacity. IBM's Watson could read 10 million financial reports in 15 seconds. So this is what they're trading on. Now, this is the point. This ruptures the relationship between labor and capital. Because if we look back at the industrial era and Henry Ford to become a millionaire needed 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 auto workers to get up every morning at 5:30 and go make cars. And Henry Ford took part of the value of those cars into his bank account to make himself a millionaire. But here you have people who are able to become millionaires and billionaires, like George Soros, without hardly any socially necessary labor, without hardly any labor at all.
Yeah.
So if the space between capital and labor has never been greater. So with that type of economy, why do you need a social contract? You have to walk away from your national working class.
At some point, it seems, however, you have to have some material at which that money's based upon, though. I mean, if everybody just stopped working tomorrow, you could still trade, but what are you trading? Because there isn't new value or new wealth coming into the system.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're having these financial crises. But that is the other half of the world economy, is still obviously globalization, production, and what we were talking about in the first part of the program, of the global assembly lines and sweatshop labor around the world. So that's part of the transnational economy, but this is another part of the transnational economy. And it's part of the transnational economy that allows, as I said, capital to walk away from their working class. So why do you need...
Because they're not connected to any national political system per se.
And you don't need a healthy, educated working class. What you need are 15 or 20 very well-educated computer programmers and mathematicians to write you a program. I mean, Facebook just bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. It has I think 113 or 130 employees. So this is a technology of a different kind, and it's really presenting us with
Well, we may need to come
problems.
back because even though I get a glimpse of what you're talking about, I think we'd have to pursue it more for this question. That I'm still trying to get my head around the relationship between what we produce and what the value is and how somebody can function beyond the value in any meaningful way. But let's leave that aside for a moment. I want to come at this from a different perspective. If what you're claiming, that there is a developing transnational capitalist class that has representatives, people that own corporations in different regions or different nations, how is something like what's going on in the Ukraine possible? It seems like the idea of transnational capitalist class, I've got some capitalists here in Russia, I've got some here in Germany and England, I've got some over here in the US, and there's a little few guys here in Ukraine, and we're all working together to make some money off of the Ukrainian workforce. Well, why can't they all get along if they're all part of the same transnational capitalist class? Because it seems the governments, at least, are at odds.
Yes.
So how do we understand this? If there's an emerging transnational cooperation, how can we have these political crises like the Ukraine?
It's a great question, and I think it functions on two levels. First of all, there may be a common project to build a transnational economy, but there's competition within that economy. So it's not a united class in the sense that they're always working together. They're still competitive in terms of making money and driving each other into bankruptcy or whatever.
Partners, but not honest partners.
or sometimes not even partners, but transnational. So you may have Siemens versus General Electric, all who have hundreds of affiliates around the world but are competitive. But in the Ukraine, I think this is a fascinating example of the world today, because the world, I think, is in transition. I don't want to say that transnational capitalism is a completed, solidified, consolidated world system. We're in a period of historic, right. And if you look at industrial capitalism, really it took from about 1760 until the end of World War I to really consolidate itself politically and economically. And so each country comes to globalization within its own historic context, within its own culture, within its own political contradictions. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in the Ukraine. We're seeing both global contradictions and national contradictions existing at one and the same time. And so Putin and the Russians still have a nationalist perspective, and obviously, this has a long historic history within Crimea and that area that they're still functioning on politically. But yet, if you read the international press, you'll see that there's a lot of worry and a lot of talk about how much Russian money is invested in the West, how many Russians are living in London, how many of their kids are going to Oxford and Cambridge, how much oil and gas is going from Russia to Europe and other parts of the world. And so if you look at Obama's sanctions, what did he do? It was against, what, 7 or 8?
A handful of people.
Handful of people. Think about how different from Iran. When they sanction Iran, it's the banks, it's the corporations. They're not doing that with Russia because it's too integrated still. So they're slapping the hands of a few individuals, but their huge oil and energy corporations haven't been sanctioned. Their largest banks haven't been sanctioned because there's just too much, I think.
In the transnational world that's developing, as you say, we're not there. There's collaboration, there's a shared interest, but even in that, there's still jockeying for position and competition. I have one last question for you. Accepting the idea that we live in a transnational world, and we started with the concept of a social class, then it would makes sense that there is a transnational middle class professionals, a transnational working class. Doing media studies, I can see a transnational middle class that coalesces around popular culture, MTV, Disney movies, that kind of thing. What about the transnational working class, which seems like it would be hundreds of millions of people? Where does that class fit in this new era?
This new world. Well,
And we don't have a whole lot of time, but a couple minutes, maybe we can get to it.
Well, Marx had this interesting concept where he talked about a class for itself and a class in and of itself, the objective and the subjective. So I think we can say that objectively there's a transnational working class who works for these transnational corporations, who and also a managerial class that crosses borders all the time. But does it have is it a self-conscious class at this point? There are, in some unions, that consciousness of that there's a global labor and we face global corporations, but other people, millions and millions of people, are just trying to survive on a day-to-day level, no matter who they're working for, whether they're an auto worker in the South working for Honda, or a sweatshop Chinese worker in Beijing working for Walmart. So the capitalists are allowed to cross borders, and they get together at Davos and at the Bohemian Club, and but the working class, how do we communicate between ourselves? That is a much more difficult process, I think, to look at.
That's one of the things that I've been interested in here at Purdue and elsewhere, is the need for a system of communication, or a system of information and sharing, even a system of media where different social classes experiencing the world differently can proceed. What would be one of the things that they would be primarily concerned with? We have just a short time. If you were to say something the transnational working class should be addressing.
Workers of the world unite.
Unity, okay.
Unity.
Thank you for tuning in to Calumet Perspectives. We'll see you again next time with another exciting guest. Thank you.
Thank you.